Okay, welcome everyone to today's workshop. We're going to look at building first React app with data from an API. How exciting. So I guess you came here because you wanted to maybe dip your toes into React. Maybe you have just started learning about JavaScript and you wanted to explore what React is, because it seems like quite a popular framework nowadays. So just a little intro about us. So hi, my name's Kim. I'm a software engineer and tech coach at Tech Returners. But in my spare time, I work with some of my friends to design workshops for the community because we love upskilling people for free. Shannon?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Shannon. I'm a software engineer as well, and I work at a startup called Pace. I'm doing mostly front-end web development. I work with React every day, actually. So this is quite in my work zone, and I work with Kim as well with our little group called Tech Skills Workshop to build out these fun leveling up technology workshops.
Great. So just some prerequisites. So if you are here and you are a total beginner on JavaScript, don't worry, you can listen along and see if this is for you. If you have had about 6 months of experience in JavaScript and you're here to sort of upskill a little bit more about React, this workshop is just for you. But don't worry if you haven't done JavaScript before. Just listen in and get a feel for whether it's something for you. And if it is, please come along to future codebar workshops and the coach will be there to help you. So what we're going to explore today are some React key features. We're going to cover something called JSX, which is JavaScript XML. We're going to delve into the world of components. We're going to explore what events are. What do we mean by that? What do we mean when we say what state is? How is that handled in React? How do we list things out, such as these elements? And what conditional rendering is. So don't worry if these words seem a little bit strange to you right now. Don't worry, we're here to help. We're going to learn all of these concepts today through building this web application together. So this is a React app. I'm going to show you what the finished application looks like. So what I'm doing here is I'm starting the React application up using npm. My laptop is ancient, so you might have to bear with me. There you go. Perfect. Okay, while that is starting up, what we have is we have a web app where the user, it's on now, where the user can select some data that they want to retrieve from Studio Ghibli API. So if you're not aware of Studio Ghibli, it's a Japanese animation studio. So they're well known for films like Spirited Away. So we have a web app where the user can click on some buttons to navigate between films, locations, and people. And they can also search for a specific data set as well. For example, I can search for films. No, I've got in the chat, I love Studio Ghibli films. Exactly, that's why we chose it. I don't think Shannon has watched some, so I think I might convert her to Studio Ghibli films. Just so that you know as well, Shannon will shortly drop a link to the GitHub repository containing the finished application with the code to view the finished app. And then we have the start application where we're going to use today so that you can learn. We will also share the slides on the GitHub repository as well, so you have it to hand. So what is React? React is essentially a neat JavaScript library to help you build user interfaces. So what it does that's different from the traditional way of building a web app, say you've got an HTML, hypertext markup language files, you've got your CSS files, your cascading style sheets, your JavaScript, so JS files. Instead of having different files for different technologies, what React does is it combines everything into something called React Components that contains all the logic that's needed to build out your web application. So here we've got small pieces of reusable user interfaces called components. So the idea is that instead of building your web app all in one go, you start to build it in pieces. And this is very handy because it means that you can essentially provide efficient updates when data changes. So instead of having to render everything in one go, you do it in bits, which is super cool. So let's build out our first feature today. So we want to be able to see a title so that we can see what type of list we're looking at. So this is the title that we're going to build right now. So to start off with, what we're going to do is we're going to explore this concept of JSX elements. So JSX, again, is a form of XML, JavaScript XML, and it extends on JavaScript. So it does look very, very similar to HTML, but it actually isn't. It just enables us to combine JavaScript and essentially markup that looks a little bit like HTML. And what this would do is it would compile down to regular JavaScript objects and function calls. So here we've got a const, and we're going to set the title as films. So if you wanted to explore more, there's a brilliant website called Babel, or I think some people call it Babel. And on the left-hand side, I'm going to zoom in a little bit because the font size is a bit small on this website. The title that we set here in this JSX is a test title. So here H1 stands for heading number 1, as we've seen in HTML. And on the right, we can see that the full version of the JSX. So you can see actually behind the scenes, this is calling React create element function to be able to create this H1 tag with the value of test inside. So whenever we want to write some JavaScript inside of our JSX elements, we can use these curly braces here. So what I'm going to do now on the right hand side is I'm going to go into my starter application, show you what I mean. So in React, usually how you structure your application is you have your src, which is your source folder. And inside that folder, the main entry point for our application is something called app.js. So we're going to start there. So if you're starting out with learning React, recommend building it out in something called your app component or app.js first. That's like your main house, essentially. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a const type equals film. So what I'm doing there is I'm setting my string to films for the type. And inside the return, what I want to do is I want to show my title. So let's say, right, let's have an H1, which is essentially my title heading. And let's make sure I can spell this correctly, Studio Ghibli. And instead of writing films and hard coding it in, we can utilize this const that I've created up here to essentially integrate that JavaScript inside this JSX element. So let's do that now. Type. Okay, perfect. If I save, do npm start, that will start up my React application. So the great thing about React is if you start up your app and you make amendments to it and develop as you go along, then you can have your app open and keep refreshing, and it should show the changes almost immediately. I say immediately, I'm at the mercy of Google Chrome. Okay. Great, so what we have here is we have Studio Ghibli films. Excellent. So the next step is, well, that's not a very good app right now because the user can't really do anything. It's just a title. So let's add a button so that the user can click films and be able to view all of the Studio Ghibli films from the API. So the API is a public API, which means that you can utilize it for free and there's no limits on it at all. So let's design our button now. So what's going on is I am writing our button out like so. And what I'm doing is I'm going to make sure that whenever the user clicks this button, I'm going to log something out into the console. So when you're developing in React or if you're developing in React or even playing around with JavaScript, I'm recommending doing console.logs just to check that everything is okay. So let's close my bracket. Brilliant. So I've got my button and I'm going to call it films. So just to recap, this button, we've got an on-click, something called an on-click event, which means that it listens out for the user to click the button, and then we're going to perform an action, or in this case, run the function as part of that action. Yeah, it is an event. Awesome, yeah. So in HTML, just to clarify, in HTML, this on-click would be all in lowercase. So instead of the uppercase C, it will be lowercase c. In React is camel case. So that's the key difference there. So the C is capitalized. And in HTML, you might see something like class equals whatever the class is, my class. In React, it's different. In React, that is called the class name. And notice the capitalization of the letter N there as well. But in this case, we just need the on-click. So we've got a button. I'm going to log onto the console. So let's have a look at what that looks like in the app. So you can see here, we've got the button. Let me zoom in so we can see the button. Beautiful. So if we right-click on the white space, we can go to something called the inspect. This will open up the Google Chrome developer tools, which is a super handy tool to be able to drill down and see what's logging out on the console and different elements. So what I'm expecting to see is when I click this button, we're going to see clicked films on the console. Click the button, clicked films, great. If I keep clicking it, it will keep logging out, right, click films and the number of times that I'm logging it out into the console. Great. So that seems to work, which is brilliant. But it's not really helpful because now we're just logging out into the console just to help us develop our app. We now need a way to be able to have the user click that button and set something that is managing what kind of type of data we want to see, whether that be films, locations, or people. So in this case, there's a concept of something called a state. A state essentially enables different components or individual parts of this React user interface to create and manage their own data. So what happens is React will be notified. It's like, hello, React, I've changed my state. So when the state changes, then the changes that are related to that state change are made. So instead of having to load everything up again, which is very inefficient, this idea of state means that you only update the things that matter to that state change. So there's various paradigms and different ways, not paradigms, different ways of being able to track states historically in React. But recently, there's a paradigm called a React hooks syntax. So you must have been on Free Code Camp and all sorts of websites being like, what is React hook? It sounds really weird. All it is a React hook is a way of writing, enabling us to write functional components that hold state. So as before, we would have a class-based sort of component, we can just hold the state in functional components. So we're going to try and tackle that now. So in React, we have something called this new state, which is super handy and enables us to utilize this to be able to set some sort of state. So this is one type of React hook. So we're going to add this hook in now. So to be able to add the hook in, you need to remember that you need to import the, let me make this terminal go down to the bottom. So we got to import that first. So let me import news state from, let me correct that typo a second. I think I have jelly fingers today. Okay. Okay, that would work. So this would enable us to use the React hook. And what we're going to do is we are going to, instead of hard coding the type as films here, we can replace that with the new state. So we're going to have the type. So remember, the type is either films, location, or people. And we're going to set type. I'll explain in a moment what that means. Okay. So what's happening here is that we've got this type state, and this set type is the function that will update that type state. We've initialized the new state with an empty string, but if you don't initialize it with anything, you can just do this, like so. So just remove the empty string there. So new state, what does it actually return? So new state returns a pair of values, the current state of type and the function that updates it. So that's really handy because we can essentially use set type to update our state. Let's update our button to enable us to, instead of doing console.log, to affect or to change the type on our button click. So what I'm going to do is, instead of running this function on the button click, I'm going to do type films. And what this would do is it would use this set type here, films, and then that type would be films when I click the button. Okay, so what do you think would happen if I click this button? Well, if I click the button, we can see now that instead of saying Studio Ghibli, it says Studio Ghibli Films, because this films is from the type state that we set. So just to recap, this curly brackets will enable us to insert some JavaScript into our JSX elements. The next, we want to be able to click the films button so that we can view some Studio Ghibli films. At the moment, it's just a title, hello, I'm Studio Ghibli Films, but what films are you talking about? And when we talk about React, it's all about components, and this is the same in any sort of framework or languages that you might work with. When you talk about engineering, you split things out into mini pieces that do certain jobs. This is the principle of the single responsibility principle, which means that each component has one job to do. It doesn't need to depend on all sorts of components, and you might end up with a lot of trouble then. So keeping your code clean is very important, and keeping logic which are similar in one place is important. So components are little pieces that you can reuse again and again. So instead of having our button in here with our set type as films, if you remember in our diagram before, we had a side navigation bar with films, locations, and people. Why don't we group all our buttons into the side navigation bar, because they're buttons and they do a certain job? That's just one way to cut the application down. There's multiple ways in which you can split your app down into components, but we've chosen this way. So we're going to create a side navigation component to be able to do this. So to create other components, you can click on this symbol in your code editor, and in the start application, it's best practice in React to have a subfolder called components to house your components. So for the purposes of the demo, we've already created a side navigation component, but it doesn't do anything yet. Let's add some buttons into it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, at the moment, just put in my button from app, the app component, get my words jumbled up, inside my side navigation component. So you can essentially just paste it over. And you can see now that our app component is looking very clean, and that's a really good principle to strive towards. Okay, I don't have my return here yet. So the return will return your JSX out. And I'm going to add a navigation. And then I'm going to put in a class name. So this class name, don't worry, is just for the purposes of the CSS, which is behind the scenes and does all the styling. And now I can add my button that I've lifted off app.js into here. Great. So click save. So as you can see down here, it won't have worked yet, because we need to do certain things to make this work. So at the moment, we've only just lifted that button out. So in the smaller component that we've extracted out called side navigation, we need to be able to export that component so that we can import it in as a piece of the bigger puzzle inside app.js, our main house. So in the main house called app, To be able to import this component in, I need to be able to have a reference to it at the top. So let's put that in first. Import side nav from components. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to return that component. So, like so. At the moment, you can see React says, right, I'm failing to compile. And that's because we've got this idea of a set type. And at the moment, our side navigation component doesn't know anything about this set type. So what we need to do is we need to utilize something called props to be able to pass the set type function into our side navigation component so that it can have access to it and use it to set the type to films. So what are props? Props. So components can be made unique by passing different props, and you can pass data from parent to child components. All that means is we can pass some data from our main app house to the smaller pieces of the puzzle that we have. So in this case, we've got side nav that we need to pass the props to. So first of all, let's enable our smaller component, the side navigation bar, to receive some props, right? And what we're going to do is we are going to head over to our main component, and we are going to pass in the props from our app to our smaller side navigation component. So to do that, set type equals, and then we open up the brackets, curly braces, to put in our JavaScript. So what I'm doing there is I'm popping in set type, setting the type, set type prop, and I'm going to pass in the function into that as a prop. This means that in our smaller side navigation component, we now have access to set type. So now what I can do is I can do some destructuring to be able to get the set type from the props. And this is super handy because now this set type would now work, because I can be like, right, in my side navigation component, we have a button, and within the button, it means that we can click the button, use set type to be able to set the type for the whole app as shown here. So we set the whole state, which is super cool. So let's check that our app still works. So we can see now it's compiled. Great, so you can see it looks much nicer now. We've got one piece of our navigation bar. When we click it, it will set the state. So at the moment it's just films, so we don't have any other states. Okay, so I'm going to head over. Well, I'm not going to head over anywhere. I'm going to stay here and listen to Shannon. So Shannon is on next. So Shannon, it's up to you now to show us how we get this lovely data back and showing up.
Perfect. So I'm just going to share my screen. You may have to unshare yours, Kim, but let's try this out. Here we go. All right. So now that we have our films button set up and we have the titles showing, let's try to populate the data into our films. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a films component, and this component is going to house the logic for everything related to films. So it has its single responsibility of fetching data for films. We will have to make a GET request to the films, the Studio Ghibli Films API, and we will want to render the items that come back from that request. So let's take a look at creating our films component here. So I've gone ahead and I'm at a similar state that Kim was at. I'm going to start my application. And we've got it going here. All right, so we see our films. When we click on it, it updates that title. Because we already have our component films that we are exporting, within the application, I am also going to do a very similar thing to side nav where I import films just under here so we can see something as we start developing. And this hasn't been imported yet, so I'm just going to import it to this file. Right now, films doesn't return anything, so there won't be anything yet on the screen. Actually, we have to return some item, as this is a React application. So for now, I'm just going to return nothing as we take a look at fetching the data for the API. So how exactly are we going to get the data? Well, JavaScript has this API called fetch that allows us to pass in a URL here, in this case, the Studio Ghibli Films endpoint, and we are going to put the result of that into a response. Because fetch is an asynchronous function, which means it will go ahead and run fast to get this information and then continue on with the rest of the function. In this case, we want to actually wait for the data to come back before we continue with the rest of this getFilms function. And once we have that response, we are going to convert it into a JSON object, which is JavaScript object notation, and store that into our data. And in order to format this function to wait for the result of this fetch, we add in the keywords await here, and we make this function async. So I'm going to go ahead and start adding that function in. So we have function, actually we want to make this an async function, get films. And here, this will take in no parameters. We will have our response, which is set to wait for the fetch of this long string. So I'm just going to show you what the output of this Studio Ghibli result will be. This is the endpoint that we are making a request to. It's open to the public, and the result will be an array of these objects. So I'm just going to here copy over the URL that I will want and paste it into my fetch. If we go back now, I will also save on here. And once we get the result, we will convert that to a JSON object that we will be able to work with. Here we go. All right, so now that we have this getFilms set up, we're not yet using it. So if we go to the next part, we want to store the result of this into state that this films component will be able to use. So right at the top of my component, I'm going to create this new state called films, similarly to what we had done for the type. And the setter for this, I'm going to call set films. And similarly, we will use state, but now we want the default value to be an empty array. So that we've got that set up. And when we get the data back from this get films, we're going to set films as well with the data that is an array of JSON, an array of objects. Okay, so the next piece that we want to take a look at is how do we call this get films? Well, we want to use something called useEffectHook. This will let us define what to do when there are side effects in the application. So anything that causes the page to re-render or changes to the state, we can use this useEffect to trigger functions that we want to run. And in this case, we actually just want to run it on the first time that this component loads. So right now, when we run, we also will have to make sure to import this, this use state to get it to work. But right now, we're not calling this films yet. We can click on it, but we don't see anything triggering. So we are going to put this get films inside of the useEffect. And we are going to, this is some default templating. In here, we are going to have our get films function, and we are going to call get films. And in order for us to run this only when the component first mounts, we will remove any dependencies, but leave an empty array here. So now if I will put some sort of console log in here. Let's log out the data that we get back. All right, and we of course will need to import this useEffect as well. So when I first run this, let's clear our thing. So when I click on this, it is going to set the films type here, although this seems to not be returning anything yet. Let's take a look at how come this films. So if we look at the console log, nothing yet, we haven't listed the items from the request, but we can see the console log being hit only once. And the result of that request is the data that we get back from the Studio Ghibli API. If I click on this, it won't hit this console log. If you take a look, if I remove this, then it's going to be running many, many times, which we don't want because that is inefficient. So we add the empty array there to say only do this once when the component first loads. All right, so now that we can see data coming back, let's take a look at how we can display that data. So what we have here is, in order to render a list of items, we're going to be using the JavaScript map. And within the map, we want to return a list of elements. And this is going to be iterating over all of the films data that we've set in the state. And with each film, we want to display some information that we have from the Studio Ghibli. So one of those is title. Let's try just displaying the title to start. And we also need to specify this key when we use, when we are returning a list of elements, because React will use this key to identify when changes have occurred and will make efficient updates when necessary. So if I have a list of 10 items and only the first one changes, the key will be able to help React say only update the first element and not all of them. All right, so everything that we want to display on screen, as Kim had mentioned, we want to put inside of this return. So let's start. Oh, let's start in here. So once again, when we are embedding JavaScript, we use these curly braces. So I want to iterate over all the films. And for each film, I want to return, this is just some JavaScript shorthand, but we want to return an element in which we will specify a key that is equal to, again, we are injecting JavaScript here, so we are putting the curly brackets, and we will say the key is going to be the film title because we can assume that that will be unique. And inside of here, let's just have some sort of title, and we'll use H3 for now to display the film title as well. So let's see if we can get something on the screen now. So this is looking a bit better. When we first load it, it's set to films. It's requesting all the films data, and it is outputting that information. Okay. So within our app file, at the moment, we just are setting an empty string, but we want to always just set it to films so that we don't have to click on it each time. We have that in here. And then now let's set the search functionality. This is another missing piece of our application. So I'll go back to films here, and let's take a look at how we can actually set the search. So this search feature, the user story for it is, as a user, I want to be able to search by the film's title so I can quickly find what I need rather than having a long list of titles. I want to quickly grab the title and display the information for it. So in order to do so, we will create a search component. We will have a search state, and within the component, we will want to have a label and an input that we are able to type in. And each time we update our state, we want to show that there's been a change in the input. Okay, so let's go ahead and just get that started. So we have this empty search component here. Let's first return a label with the input field. So we'll have this here. I will just create a label. We will specify that this is for, now we'll just have search type. We will make this more unique later as well. And this label will say search type to start. And we'll have our input here that includes the ID of the same item. So this HTML form might look familiar to you. This label input might look familiar in HTML. In React, we have to include HTML in front of this rather than just having the for. And this will indicate that the label is for the input of the same ID. I'm just going to create a simple input field here. We use these shorthanded React fragments, they're called, in order to create a parent for this search component. So now that we have some simple label and input, let's go to our films and add the search in. So we are going to have search there. And another shorthand, when we have no children for search, we can actually just remove the second part of the element and close it there. And this, once again, has to be imported. So if we now display, we can see something on our screen that's the search input, but it doesn't yet do anything. So what we have to do is we want to add an on change for this input type. And this will listen for changes to the input. And when that input changes, we want to also set the search value to what has been typed in the input. So I'm going to go ahead and in my films, I'm going to have my search state as well as the set search. This will also use state that we will initialize to an empty string. And similarly to what we did previously, we're going to pass the set state into the search component here as a prop. So we have that value passed through, and then in search, we need to take in that search value. And we again are going to destructure out the set search from props. So on this input field, we need a few more attributes. We're going to specify this is of type text, and we are going to add our on change event. And again, we will have this point to a function that accepts an event as the parameter. And we are going to just set that search value with the value that is coming from our on change function. So I'm just going to add another console log here so that we can see what this event value looks like. And we can see that as we type, the value will change. So let's go to our React app. Let's try typing. So now the values aren't yet filtering, but I can see that every time I type, this on change is logging the output. And we should be also setting the search through our set search. So if we wanted to, we could also log out our search value. And if I just remove this other log now, I can see that each time that I type, the search value inside of films is also updating. Okay. So the next step here is we want to pass through the type films into search so that we get a little bit more descriptive labels so that it's not just search type. We want to actually say what type that we're searching. So within the search component, we know that whenever we're in the films file, we're always going to be passing through films. And then within search, we can now have access to that prop type, and we can include this type in a few different pieces. So I'm going to include it for one in this HTML4, which will point to the ID of what we are searching for. I'm just going to turn this into a template string so we can inject our JavaScript. And similarly, we are going to put the type in the label and also update the ID here and change this again to a template literal. And then if we save, we should see the label update now with films. So this will make this component a little bit more reusable and also descriptive to what we are displaying. Okay, so the next step is to filter the films by the titles, starting with the characters in the search state. So as I type into my input, I want to filter the films that we display by that title. So we are going to be using this javascript.filter, taking the title of the film that we are on, just converting it to a lowercase version and checking that it starts with the search value lowercase as well. In order to do that, we are going back to the films.js file, and here where we map, we also want to filter. So right before we display the items, this is where we're going to filter it. So we're going to add a dot filter, and this will also take in the film, and it will output the results that have been filtered. So I'll just take this out because we want to return the value right away. And with each film, we have the title. We're going to lowercase it so we can search regardless of casing. And check that it starts with the value of the search. And once we've filtered the items, we are still going to map over them and display each title. So let's take a look and see if that has worked. So there's no films called this long string of characters, but if I search for castle, I can start seeing the values filtering. My neighbor, there's a few films of that name, and it's case insensitive, so we can do uppercase or lowercase there. So that seems to be working as expected, which is great. And just before we go on to the next piece, let's add a little bit more information to this films. So we know from the Studio Ghibli API that we have access to some other information like the description, the release date, the Rotten Tomatoes score. So we're also going to be displaying that. So I'll create a div here, and we are going to have 4 items that we want to display for this films. And within here, let's display what information do we have access to. So we have director. That seems like it would be good to display. And here I'm going to inject the JavaScript, and this will be film.director. So we're using the key that is specified back from the API. Let's also show the producer, film.producer. Let's display the release date. Release date. So the API returns this different snake casing. So we just have to be careful about that when we type it in here as well. And then let's also display the Rotten Tomato score. And this will be film.rt score. So now that I've saved it, I will be able to see some values showing up. So this is cool. If I search for that item, I get a little bit more information on that film. And I also will add a little bit of styling. So we have already class that we've been imported in here. We're going to use some of the values that we've specified to update some of the colors and just the padding and everything. So in here, let's add something to contain all of these items. So I'm going to turn this into a div that has the class name list container, as well as it here, and then We will have one that will be the card. This will wrap this item. And let's add a couple more. Class name. Here will be item, and let's also wrap this as being the details. So we can see this in a little bit nicer format. So now we can see that all of these will be wrapped in this sort of format. If I refresh, I should see all of them, and then as I type, I can get a more filtered view of them as well. Oh, I think I made one mistake here. This is list card, which you would define inside of your CSS. So we have the naming of all of the classes here. All right. So now that we've gotten the search working, let's do a similar thing for locations and people. So we want to display the correct type based on the component we're on. And we do this through, we can do this through functions. So we're just going to create a simple switch that when the type is films, we return films. When the type is location, we return location. And when the type is people, we return people. So we are going to do that in app and just create render type here. And this will switch based on the type. So the type here is the state. And in each case, we're going to say if it's films, we will return films. And I'm just going to go into my app and just, this is kind of a little bit repetitive. So to shorten the time, I'm just going to copy those over. We need to then import these new components. And once this has been created, we will also need to call it. So we can do that just with the brackets, render type, and we want to call this function in here. So by default, we're going to display the films. Then we will display the locations and then people. So right now, this isn't going to be working yet because our locations is empty. So the locations is going to be the same format as film. So I won't go through creating that whole component again. I'm just going to paste in the code that we have. But some quick things to note about this is, in this case, location doesn't have a title. It has a name that comes back from the Studio Ghibli API. So we're just going to update this to name. And it also has a different set of results that come back from the API. So we're going to define those there. And the same thing with people. We are just going to take the created people and save that. So in here, same thing, a person is being filtered by the name, and it has a different set of results that return from the API. So if we save those both now, we should see that, well, we still don't yet have the different types that we can click on. So that's one of the first things that we'll need to do. We're just going to copy what we have for films 3 times. We're going to have one for location. This will display location, and we'll have one for people that will set people. So now we have these 3 buttons. And when we click on them, we should be able to, so we may have not set this type correctly. Let's see if it's plural locations. Yeah. So now that we are setting the type, each time we click on these different buttons, it will set that the type within application, and we will also get back the data for those. So the fetch URL is changed to get information from that specific endpoint, as well as here in location. So now when we search for people, it will search for the set of data within that component, which is exactly what we want. Irontown or the CAD Kingdom. We'll see some results for. Awesome. So let's take a look at what is left. So we've already imported this render type into the application, and we've added these different similar components for films, as well as location, including location and persons. Awesome. So just at the end of the workshop here, we've created our application. We are able to click on these different buttons, get different results for them, and be able to search the data that is coming back from them. And what we've covered today includes some key features of React, JavaScript, XML, also known as JSX, components, events, state, listing items, and conditional rendering. So thank you all for joining today.
Thank you, everyone. You can see in the chat, oh, Shannon just made it. React in an hour. Great to see that everyone's enjoyed the session. So what I've done is I've dropped down the link to the codebar YouTube channel, so the recording will be available in a couple of weeks' time. Please head over to the GitHub repository if you wanted to look at the code, and we'll pop these slides from the session on there as well. So yeah, hope you enjoy the rest of the festival. There's so many sessions. So yeah, there's a session with two of our friends. Just drop it in there. They will be doing a GitHub Pages workshop later on. So be sure.
Thank you everyone for coming. It's been great to show you a little bit about React. Bye.
Cool.